Welcome once again, and I would like us to look at Paul arrest. Maybe we have heard or we know that Paul was arrested, and have been arrested. He was arrested in Jerusalem. But before that, Paul had also been arrested for the first time at Philippi. But the most commonly known, or the most known arrest of Paul, it was done in Jerusalem. And before he was arrested, some people, some friends, tried to warn him not to go to Jerusalem. In fact, even some prophets, they had prophesied that Paul would be arrested in Jerusalem, and he would be handed over to Gentiles. We can see that, for example, in Acts 21 verse 4, where the disciples in Tyre tried to prevent Paul from going to Jerusalem. We can also see Prophet Agabus in Acts 21 8 to 11, where he prophesied that he took the Paul belt and he tied himself, and he prophesied that whoever this belt belongs to will be tied like this in Jerusalem and will be handed over to Gentiles. But even if it was in the prophecy, Paul was not deterred from going to Jerusalem. Even his friends, like the author of this book of Acts, that is Luke, they tried to convince him, but they could not be able to persuade him not to go to Jerusalem. Now, we may ask ourselves, why was Paul so convinced? Even when the prophecy was coming, his friends were trying to stop him from going to Jerusalem. He was so adamant to go to Jerusalem. We can find that answer in Acts 20 verse 22, because he was compelled by the Spirit of God that he has to go to Jerusalem to testify about the risen king. And it was within the will of God that Paul had to go to Jerusalem. Now, when he arrived at Jerusalem, he arrived some few days before the Pentecost. And he met with James, who we believe was a senior in the church. And he was welcomed. He gave them the news how the church, how the Gentiles have received the gospel. But James told him about some rumors that were going on. And the rumors were that Paul had been preaching, or had been teaching people against the laws of Moses, and had been teaching the Jews that were in diaspora against following the law of Moses, against circumcision, and a lot of things against the customs of the Jews. And those were rumors. And James, together with the other elders, they decided to see how they can solve this issue, because they were expecting that the Jews would automatically know that Paul has come to Jerusalem. And so they told Paul, you need to join some people who are in their purification period, so that they can see that also you are following the law of Moses through purification, the shaving of the hair. And he joined them. He accepted as a sign to show that he also submitting to the laws of Moses. But when Paul was in the temple, the Jews who were the Jews from the diaspora, the Asia Minor, they started a riot when they saw Paul in the temple. And by that, Paul was arrested, and they were accusing him that he was teaching people against the law of Moses. He was teaching people against circumcision, against the Jews, and against Jerusalem. And they also accused him that he had brought non-Jews, Gentiles, into the temple. It was against the rule of the Jews for Gentiles to enter into the temple. Actually, the temple was divided into sections, and to a particular point, there were a lot of signs, a lot of written warnings saying that the Gentiles are not allowed to go beyond that point. And so they were accusing Paul that he had brought Jews into the temple. That was because they had seen him with one of his friends, one of his convert from the who are Gentiles, and they thought that Paul had brought him even inside the temple. And by doing so, he was arrested. The Roman soldiers came and they were able to save him from being stoned by the Jews. And the following day, he was taken into the Sanhedrin. Paul, noticing that there were Pharisees and Sadducees, he spoke in such a way that they were conflicting each other. And the case was not determined. And the Sadducees and the high priest were planning to kill him. And from that point, Paul was transported to Caesarea. So I want you to note this. He was arrested in Jerusalem, taken to Caesarea. So at Caesarea, the Jews came. After around 5 days, they came to Caesarea. And they also had another sitting there. And when he stood to put a defense, Paul was able to put a defense that even the ruler, Felix, was able to be convinced that Paul was not guilty. But the Bible says that this ruler, this governor, Felix, was corrupt. And he didn't release Paul. So he said that Paul should be kept into prison, and as he determined his matter. But he kept on calling him now and then to see if he can give him a bribe. And by doing so, Paul remained in Caesarea in prison for 2 good years until Felix retired, and another new governor came into power, and that was Ferista. And now Festus, sorry, and now that was Festus. And now this Festus also, because he was trying to have favor with the Jews, he also had the case. That was after 2 years after he was being arrested. And after listening to Paul's defense, he realized that also Paul was not deserving to be in prison or to be put to death. But he asked Paul, "Do you want to be released to go back to Jerusalem?" This was because he wanted to play safe and show the Jews that he was good. But Paul at that point pleaded that he said that he wanted an appeal to be taken to Caesar. And to Caesar, that meant he would be taken to Rome. And Festus said that if you have appealed to go to Caesar, then to Caesar you shall go. And he was prepared, and through a very rough journey, Paul was taken to Rome under a Roman captain. And he arrived in Rome, where he was put under house arrest for 2 good years. And it was from that point that Paul wrote the 4 famous prison epistles. That is Colossians, Philippians, Philemon, and Ephesians. And he was living in a rented house where he was free to preach the gospel. He was free to receive guests. And he did a great work while he was in that house arrest, such that even in the book of Philippians, he says even some of the household of the Caesar had believed in him. He was able even to convert the household of Caesar, even in the Paris. So we see when Jesus came to Paul, he had mentioned in chapter 9 that he would use him to testify about Jesus to the kings. And surely Paul, even though it came through an arrest, he was able to testify to King Agrippa, to Governor Festus, to Governor Felix, and even to Caesar himself. And we can understand Rome was a center of the world then. It was the capital of the Roman Empire. So by preaching at Rome, we can be sure that the gospel was spreading to all part that was under Roman Empire. And by doing so, what Jesus had said in Romans 1:8, that he will preach from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria and to the end of the world, was happening right from Rome. So it was within God's will that Apostle Paul would be arrested and taken all the way to Rome, that he can preach the gospel from that point. And that's how the arrest of Paul was. Thank you.